So firstly, I'd like to offer my gratitude to the panel for accepting to be involved with this inquiry and engaging so openly and honestly with the public. I was a participant in yesterday's community forum and found it to be really well organised and a just process to hear all the voices present. So I thank you for that. I would also like to thank the Honourable Chief Minister and his advisors for commissioning the inquest, and last but not least, all the people who have taken the time to seek to understand the impacts of this industry and hold hope for a better future for the planet than what we see as being predicted at the moment. I'm grateful to Professor Melissa Haswell for providing her PowerPoint presentation as a framework for my presentation. I found this was forwarded to me because my focus was to be on the public health component. I'm not sure what the public health presentation in Alice Springs provided, but I'm hoping that it'll be different because I'm not actually using this, used it as a framework. After reading a vast amount of papers, I had decided that what I wanted to include was covered by Professor Haswell briefly, but I thought for this panel there was a need for more robust reference to the evidence. So I've included excerpts and provided further reference where possible. I'd also just like to, whoops, that's already gone there. It looks like it's actually going to go ahead on its own. I think I forgot to take the timing off. So I'd just like to also declare my stance as no human, however embedded in scientific research, is free of bias. And it's actually hardwired into our brains, and the negativity bias is designed to protect us from danger. We take more notice of bad things that happen throughout our day than the good. We look for proof to support our own beliefs, even though in science we're directed to be objective. And even our smallest influences, like the gifting of a pen, has been shown to influence behaviour. And there's evidence around that that we're hardwired, and some research that sort of went into, and why I'm getting to this is that I do talk a little bit about bias, and that we're all sort of subject to that, and really by applying mindfulness, I've hoped that I've been able to at least be aware of my bias, because obviously I'm very connected to nature and things. So I've used my skills as a health professional to review as much of the literature as possible, very briefly, really only over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and I've applied mindfulness skills to be aware of the bias, as I said. So my mission is to promote an environmentally sustainable, socially just and spiritually fulfilling human existence on this planet. And I've completed the Game Changer Intensive course, which is designed by Pachamama Alliance, who have an alliance with the Achua in the Amazon jungle, who have been fighting the petroleum company for over 20 years. And I have hope that enough humans will respond by taking positive actions to make survival for all beings more possible. I speak from the feminine power base that is attuned with a connected human experience. This connectedness is being explored and verified by many scientists, especially in the fields of quantum physics and neuroscience and neurobiology. And this is relevant to this paper, as the first term of reference is to assess the scientific evidence to determine the nature and extent of the environmental impacts and risks, including the cumulative impacts of the fracking, which you're aware of all that quite well, obviously. Which leads the background and issues paper is, so I'm just sort of having a look at that. So other presenters that I've seen on the streamlining recreational fisheries and the frack-free Darwin have highlighted the simplistic representation of the chemicals on page 9. And I'd just like to add my concern here, and I've heard the response to that. But I'd just also like to add that individuals have different levels of sensitivity, and whilst any individual may be able to avoid lipstick or hairspray or going and having a perm, if the air or water contains these chemicals, they can't avoid them. Research may not actually identify the effects on sensitive people, because it's often across a broad spectrum of people who are usually well. And a list of the chemicals used that are linked to ill health would obviously be useful. A lot of people have said that. And it's often also hard to sift out whether people are talking about the ones that are going to be banned, that won't be allowed here, and what will they use is similar, which people have also referenced. So So with the actual terms of reference, in regard to the inquiry assessing the scientific evidence, at yesterday's public forum, the panel explained that the scientific evidence includes social sciences and evidences rather than just really being a very rigorous gold standard, double-blind sort of placebo study type of evidence. And I'll make reference, I am actually making reference to the 2014 Hawke paper, which dismissed some of that evidence because it believed its methodology was poor and lack of peer review. Number 2 was to advise on the gaps. A lot of people have spoken very emotionally and strongly about requirements for baselines, and I'll refer to the Lancet Countdown, which is a very prestigious medical journal, and their project that they're doing for measuring, and that's the video, the very short video that I'm hoping will work. Number 3, for the risks, advise on the level that would be considered acceptable. So my cautions are around the risk model, which other people have mentioned as well. Who bears the risk? Who determines what is a level in reduction that is low as reasonably practicable? Page 13. And the person from Environmental Defenders has raised that one as well. Under methodology, on number 5, to have regard to relevant domestic and international reviews, and you've just spoken to that you won't be... it does actually say in there that the 2014 Hawke report is an important document for the panel, and I just wanted to mention I do have major concerns to the tone and the way I read that of bias. I don't know the person, I don't know anything more much about it other than I've only just read it in the last couple of weeks. And there are numerous background papers and inquiries that have been conducted around the world that identify numerous risks, but they all seem to come up with different recommendations. So a lot of the stuff is based, and so that's why I'm questioning bias. And that can often be implicit. People actually don't know what they don't know. They don't know that they're being affected, according to some studies that I referenced before. So some claim safety if best practice is utilised. Some say it would be okay with more rigorous baseline studies and regulation. Some have placed moratoriums and require more evidence, whilst others have placed bans on the industry. The recommendations are based on many assumptions, and also some of them are quite dated, and I'll point to some other evidence about that changing recently. So my reading has identified an area previously unknown to me, and that is that unconventional gas is not an acceptable bridge to renewables. So I wasn't actually aware of the other speaker when I was watching this. I was hoping that this was going to be covered, so I thought, oh great, I can just skip straight to mine, and then by the time I left home it wasn't. So I've just added in some very impromptu slides. This is just a cover page of the review of the current future methane emissions, which is the one that I gave Professor Hart the cover page of yesterday, or not the inside page. And these cover a lot of the discussion that, I'm sorry, was it Jonathan? I'm not sure of the gentleman's name who spoke to before me about the mitigation of the methane.
Mr. Tutty.
Yeah.
Mr. Tutty,
So,
yes.
So a lot of these papers have what he was talking about in there.
Thank you.
So the discussions on the methane so multiple sources make reference to more immediate effects on the global warming that methane has over carbon dioxide, especially in the short term. So the differing reports, as far as I read it, seem to be related to the measuring and over 20 years compared to over 100 years. So if you're measuring over 20 years, you'll see the effect of methane, which does break down or whatever. But it does actually have a lot larger heating capacity. It's beyond my scope to really go into it, but I will provide these papers. One of them, the Climate Health Alliance. It's got the Public Health Association, Australian Nursing and Midwifery Association, the National Toxics Network, Australian Medical Students Association, and several others who actually collaborated on the papers. And these papers provide evidence that unconventional gas exploitation is not the bridge to renewables that will reduce greenhouse gas and global warming, and that some scientific calculations indicate that the methane produced will increase warming more than coal. And that was just, again, just very quickly out of the Melbourne Institute, out of that paper. They say that it's 86 times more powerful than carbon dioxide when its atmospheric warming impacts are considered. I mentioned that. And just looking at the vast potential of unconventional gas, that accumulative effect. And these measurements have led the US Environmental Protection to increase the official estimates of methane emission from the total upstream oil. So really they're looking at all of it, all sort of put together. But I'm no expert, and I'm sure that you'd be able to gain more from reading these papers than I can. The Climate Council that I mentioned, a submission to independent review into the future security of the national electricity market. They said there are insufficient field studies and no baseline studies to quantify the impact of fugitive emissions associated with unconventional gas development and extraction in Australia. However, if methane emissions in Australia are equivalent to levels in the United States, any emissions benefit of choosing gas over coal may be cancelled out. Also, they've recommended no new gas plants or infrastructure to be built because they're just locking that gas into the future, which was discussed yesterday. And today, the cheapest new electricity sources are renewables, and that's from Bloomberg New Energy Finance 2016. This paper I've read thoroughly and referenced, looked up some references. The PSR, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, it's a compendium of scientific, medical and media findings. And in regard to the climate change effects, and this is an older, this one's 2015, some of the other were 2016, even a 2017 paper. So they say that natural gas is a bigger threat to climate than previously believed. And again, we've got that 20-year time frame coming up with similar stats that they've got in there. And in the heavily drilled Barnett Shale of northeastern Texas, the methane emissions were shown to be 50% higher than the EPA had estimated. And fracking operations and associated infrastructure contribute 71 to 85% of the methane emissions in the region. And they're talking about not necessarily accidental leaks, but from losses that are inherent to the design of the machinery or to normal operating use, and are therefore not possible to mitigate. The methane leakage at the levels now being documented negates and outweighs previously hypothesised benefits from burning methane instead of coal in most existing power plants. So you can go on to read more there. There's one more paper as well that I've accessed on that has quite a fair, just mentions a little bit on the methane as well in that paper. So unconventional gas is a climate risk, which you've got there, the fugitive emissions, that's very potent, methane being a very potent greenhouse gas, and of course, obviously, as we mentioned before, unconventional gas deters the investment in the much cleaner renewables of energies of wind and solar. So that then I'll briefly just mention this is the environmental determinants of health and how climate change impacts that. So I suppose that's sort of on the assumption that unconventional gas is not a bridge to renewables, and being aware of the numerous risks, I sort of say, why would we even consider trying to risk manage it? And the United Nations Environment Programme issued a global environmental alert system, or through that system back in 2012, said that it may have unavoidable environmental impacts, that have all been mentioned before, that really can't be reversed. The body of evidence for these, the health risks of climate change, are indisputable and have been referred to as catastrophic. Health organisations and collaborations of leading researchers are producing material to guide the public on how to minimise their risk. These are just three sort of like leaflets that you would pick up generally in your public health or your GP place, whatever. They tell you how the individual can sort of do things to help, the actions they can take to prepare for extreme heat waves, how you can, actions you can take to prepare for climate change, how to protect yourself from mosquitoes, so all of those sorts of things. So, I mean, this is, they're actually not even looking at prevention. It's like, well, here are the leaflets and it's just up to you, the individual, to try and make yourself safe. Whereas really there should be a lot more emphasis on policy and on government. And it's in relation to the release of heat-trapping gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. Oops, that's gone forward. Shouldn't have got to there yet. I'm not sure, did Alice Springs at all talk about the environmental determinants of health? I'm sure you're probably all quite sort of familiar. I mean, basically we need clean air, water security, nutritious food, stable, safe climates, meaningful livelihoods, resilient and cohesive communities. And our previous speaker, has obviously highlighted that in the, and although that was, I think, coal seam gas, but still, all those sorts of things that can have effects on local and, sort of going out in these concentric circles to the global effects at the top level there, and biodiversity and climate change. Is it possible to see the little video now, if we can swap to that? So the Lancet, the medical journal I mentioned, have started a project called the Lancet Countdown, and they're sort of trying to look at it more from a positive angle. And this one says it a lot better than I can if we can get it to work. So the Lancet collaborators are looking at the steps to tackling climate change as the greatest opportunity of the 21st century. And if we run with that assumption,
the risks of climate change are unacceptably high. In fact, they're potentially catastrophic for human health. Climate change directly impacts human health, resulting in loss of life from extreme weather like droughts, floods and heat waves. But it will also damage the ecosystems we rely on for good health, resulting in more polluted air, decreased crop yields and undernutrition, and threatening our supply of clean drinking water. Climate change will bring social change. As sea levels rise, mass human migration will lead to overcrowding, pressure on scarce resources, and possibly violent conflict. Heat waves can be fatal for people aged 65 and over. This exposure will increase over the next century. But demographic data shows populations are migrating and ageing into areas worst affected by climate change, and the true exposure increase for the over 65s is likely to be even greater. The current global energy mix, which emphasises fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas, has a profound impact on human health. As well as exacerbating climate change, fossil fuels are already causing heart and lung disease directly through poor air quality. The long-term effects from fossil fuels on global climate change will have even greater and more far-reaching effects on human health. But the news isn't all bad. This diagram lays out many of the key responses to climate change, all of which have significant co-benefits for human health. Low-carbon vehicles and active transport like walking and cycling decrease air pollution and carbon emissions, and also decrease obesity and cardiovascular disease. In fact, through these co-benefits, and by preventing the potential loss to economic development, responding to climate change could be the biggest global health opportunity of this century. Most people view climate change as a threat, but there's significant variation. Over 70% of the population in Brazil, South Korea and Greece understand that climate change is a major threat, compared to 40% or less in the USA and China. Trends of parts per million CO2 emissions are difficult to appreciate, but increasing asthma rates or exacerbating childhood undernutrition are tangible health problems that people relate to. Whether we respond to climate change, turning the threat it poses into an opportunity to improve public health, is no longer a question of scientific evidence or technological capability. It is now entirely a matter of political commitment. The health profession has a vital role to play in driving this transition, communicating the risks and ensuring climate change policies promote public health. We need to be at the forefront of this issue, helping to create a healthier future.
So that's a lot of my... Yes.
5 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. So pretty much my message is that if we can look at the methane emissions, if the panel can really look into that, you have the science background in that area that I don't, and if we can make that assumption that it is significantly going to contribute more, and it isn't a bridge, then why are we looking at it? You've mentioned you're going to employ an economist as well to look into the costs. So rather than looking at the risks, let's actually see, is this even worth looking at, with all the other risks that have been identified. And to the extent that we can actually look at it as a positive and think, well, how can the NT actually be a leader in the world of instigating some policies to put that money and all the things you'd have to do with all this testing of with kits and and all those things, which is great if as a baseline. I admire that. I think it's a great idea, but you really need to be, for the policies to be looking at the renewable of what they can do with that. So we've. But just in case, the Lancet also goes into a whole lot of measures that they've identified. So it would actually be something that a government would be able to say, hey, look, like some of the hospitals that are now green hospitals, and by having some measures that show that you and have plans to reduce your greenhouse gases, that you'd actually be applauded by someone like the Lancet. But just in case, some may see the terms of reference more narrowly than I do, and not accepting the climate change as a threat, and looking at and that the unconventional gas may outweigh any reduction in carbon dioxide. They're not sort of looking at that. I'll just speak directly to the actual effects on public health of the fracking industry. And the terms of reference include the whole spectrum of the industry, so we're not just looking at the drilling of the wells and the extraction of the gas, but how people view the effects on health will obviously depend on their angle of their lens, on how wide a view they're looking at that. So in this one, so obviously the hydraulic fracking could be just looked at that, or the whole thing said that. There's a lot of studies that have been done that look at the distance from the well site to the different problems, the potential public health problems. The terms of reference state that the ill health effects on workers in the industry are beyond its scope. However, we have seen that as workers are the closest to hazard, health effects are likely to be seen here first. Take asbestos as an example. The mining, transport and use of silica is a major concern. I refer the panel to the evidence on silica as a cause of lung cancer and silicosis, which scars the lungs similarly to asbestos. The Compendium Scientific, Medical and Media has more on that. That compendium as well lists a lot of the other health problems, and there's evidence for skin and upper respiratory, hospital admissions for heart and nerve problems, decreased average birth weights in small gestational age infants, and higher incidence of heart defects at birth. Further research is needed into reported neuroendocrine disorders, especially those resulting in antenatal concerns for the unborn child. Of concerns are the radioactive releases. There is a lot of evidence in the form of measurements of the Marcellus Shale in the USA, with radium as high as 3,600 times the US Environment Protection Agency's limit for drinking water, as referenced before. And then I'll try not to spend too much, but the Hawke paper in 2014 claims that it didn't dismiss reports of health effects, but the quote below indicates that only rigorous peer-reviewed articles were taken into account. So that was, I won't actually read it, but it's the quote is from 1.1.2, the challenges for the inquiry. And just the end part says, while not dismissing the importance of these concerns and the need for increased understanding and monitoring of validated research into this aspect, the inquiry was not able to identify verified studies that supported the claims. So they were saying that there was limited data, so basically, if there's no data, then there are no risks, is the way I read it. So I don't know the intention of it, but is this assuming that because there is limited data suggesting the increased health risks, that there are none? And we've heard similar messages from the tobacco industry, and then they were infiltrated the science with skewed and biased reports and denied there was an issue. Years ago, actually, I read a script for scientific evolution of hazards or identifying things. 1, there is no evidence. Then a few years later, 2, okay, you have some evidence, but it's not gold standard or enough to take action. 3, okay, there might be something in this. And 4, this is a major health hazard. And the unconventional gas industry, especially in its current expansive form in the US, is still in its infancy for adequate studies into public health to be conducted. And we've got about the lack of transparency of chemicals you're aware of. The next... this is actually the paper of the Intara, of the doctor who, because the Queensland government wasn't actually doing any, even the doctors they sent went to the town 70 kilometres away or something. So this I can provide as well. He has a lot of graphs in there. Now he said his methodology, is poor to look at from a study because it actually went to the people that had the problems. But it's still very worthwhile having a look, and I don't think it should be disregarded.
You have 1 minute left, so if you want to make your concluding remarks, please do so.
So the science, this is just a picture of how the evidence has increased over the years, and it's really only beginning to be developed. You're aware of the water. I did just look up this. We spoke yesterday about the water, the 30 gigalitres, what's it relates to. This town is trying to harvest an additional 30 megalitres of stormwater per year for irrigation of public open space. That's one fracking. And the Lucerne uses like 6 to 8 megalitres per hectare for the whole year of irrigation. So there's... that one there was just a research into the haematological cancer that all of the children who lived, all the under 24 who lived closest to the site, that was the highest area of where the cancers are found. That one can be read. Obviously, you're aware of the social emotional solastalgia, which comes from having just feeling total despair that you've got no power, that the land has been degraded, can lead to depression and even suicide. And obviously the competition and things like that. So, basically my concluding request to the panel is to consider that due to the possibly irreversible risks to human health, that the moratorium on fracking be continued in the NT until the effects of global warming on health by the year of the target for reductions, preferably 2050, but maybe 2030, as held till then, and then review the risk analysis. If the risk is reduced to an acceptable level, say by advances in technology, improved practice, baseline measurements in place, ill health effects have strong evidence to not occur, then the next generation will benefit from a gas reservoir that will be depleted in other parts of the world and likely to be more viable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Baker. You've got a wealth of information. I take it we'll have access to the slides, and you've produced that to the inquiry?
Yes. I've got it on my stick today. You've got the PowerPoint on there, but I can give you what I've said and all of the papers I've got.
Yes, please. That would be absolutely invaluable. Thank you very much. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, Professor Priestley.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that thank you for that presentation. Many of the issues that you've raised are things that I'll need to consider as part of the inquiry. And I have some of the references you've cited, but I think that by providing your PowerPoint will enable me to chase up some more of those important references. So thank you very much for that.
Yes, I just simply echo the comments from Professor Priestley that in terms of the greenhouse gases, you've referenced a number of papers and certainly some of those I'm familiar with, so it's good to be able to see that you've accessed those. I'd be interested to see the other ones that you've been using as well.
I should say that the inquiry does take a more expansive view of the shale gas industry, unconventional shale gas industry. And I think it encapsulates many of the risks and themes, and you would have seen that from the paper. There being no further questions, again, thank you very much for your detailed and comprehensive presentation, Ms. Baker, and we'll now adjourn for an hour's break and resume at 8 p.m. Thank you.